Tom Reynolds' presentation, Educating Care, Transformation and Disability in Theological Education, was the original title. What you're going to hear is that with some edits that he's made, not only in light of the fact that he knows it's being delivered by a different voice, but I think he's also made some adjustments based on his awareness of who exactly is here. So again, we're a very nimble group. John Sharon lives in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He worships in Lowell at a Presbyterian congregation. But where he becomes my hero is that he is the director of a middle school. In fact, a Christian middle school in Lexington, Massachusetts. Thank you, John.
I used to think channeling was a decidedly un-Christian practice. But today, I still do, but today I'm channeling Tom a little, I think. The other thing I just wanted to share with you is that I have Lior's voice in my head. Read slowly. Educating Care, Transformation and Disability in Theological Education. I'd like to frame this presentation by beginning with an illustrative story. I was to tell this story in my presentation on Monday, which was canceled because I could not attend. However, telling it here might be helpful to set up the problem I would like to address today. The audience cringed as he told his story. Speaking to a group of about 20 attentive listeners was an articulate, compassionate, and successful businessman in his early 60s, quietly recalling his public rejection by a priest. Some years ago, as he approached a church altar for communion during worship, a priest singled him out, exclaiming loudly and with disgust, "We don't serve drunks here." True, this man talks with slurred speech and moves with a jolted gait, yet he does not drink. He has cerebral palsy. This story unsettles easy assurances. It exemplifies how easily someone can be misunderstood and excluded on the basis of that misunderstanding. While the implications extend far beyond disability, for example, we might ask, just who does the priest serve? In the case of this man, the rejection began there, ironically, in the very place where one would expect inclusion and welcome to prevail. Of all places, Jenny Weiss-Block notes, our religious communities should be models of accessible communities, a point of entry into God's love radiating through the lives of its participants. For Block, the body of Christ presumes a place for everyone. However, place is difficult for persons with disabilities. Too often, encountered are thresholds in our communities that signal access denied, whether physical, behavioral, or attitudinal. This is tragic for both those with and those without disabilities. For specific kinds of people are rendered helpless or deficient in some way or ways by others. On this basis, they are excluded from participation, which diminishes their genuine humanity. Also diminished are faith communities themselves, as disabling principalities and powers come to obscure how people with disabilities can and do make real contributions to their communities, which thwarts the redemptive work of God. So it becomes important to reflect theologically about how persons of faith might engage the issue of disability with a more critical and compassionate edge. But I must confess, part of what unsettles me about this story I related above is not the overt gesture of exclusion by the priest, scandalous as it is. It is also my own reaction to the story that bothers me, my own cringe, which indicates an attempt to empathetically align with the one excluded and assure myself that in a similar circumstance I would not be as judgmental, that I would not condescendingly condescendingly rejecting someone on the basis of my own false pretenses, and instead be welcoming and inclusive. What troubles me about my reaction is not its well-meaning intention to connect with and affirm another human being, but rather its own, perhaps more subtle, kind of pretense, one that assumes the authenticity of its own understanding of another, and thus the rightness of its own practices of care and inclusion. Sometimes the stories we tell about ourselves, about who we are, what we do or have achieved, interfere with the work of genuinely attending to other persons as they are, subjects of their own experiences and unique ways of being in the world. I am speaking about communal practices of care that have inclusion as their focus, and I wish to problematize such care and inclusion as potential hindrances as their focus. And I wish to problematize such care and inclusion as potential hindrances in making space for differences, specifically in processes of opening access for people with disabilities to participate fully in community life. As a theological educator, I am particularly worried about this matter. For theological education is engaged in the formation of ministers who are being trained to administer care in ways that are compassionate and inclusive, concerned with the well-being of others. However, the administering of care often is subject to administrative systems and power mechanisms that actually prevent genuine care. Caring, compassion, and inclusiveness are often distorted. Because of this, compassion and inclusivity are more than generous attitudes or dispositions. They require normative criteria to focus their attention on adequately caring for the concrete needs of others. Put bluntly, one must care justly with the good of others in mind. Theological education, then, should not only nurture generous hearts, but also critical minds that are self-aware and socially engaged in a way that names, critiques, and transforms practices that do not respect the integrity of persons. Thus, a key part of educating care must be deconstructive in nature, involving the dismantling of unjust apparatuses so as to open up liberative possibilities for caring rightly for the well-being of others. When it comes to disability, care is a category with problematic associations connected to charity, pity, tolerance, and romanticized notions of specialness. For care to be educated and for education to be caring in a transformative way, one that liberates and empowers both non-disabled and disabled people, care must be problematized and rethought as both a disposition and practice that is embedded in relations of mutual giving and receiving and integral to faith formation. The point I'd like to stress today, as one part of this larger program that I hope materializes in a book, centers on the notion of inclusion. Namely, that the incorporative thrust of inclusion is not innocent and sometimes ill-suited to its stated intention of countering intolerance and exclusion. Stated more directly, efforts by non-disabled people to care for people with disabilities by welcoming and incorporating them in community life can be, even with generous intentions, deceptively marginalizing, and so function implicitly as forms of exclusion. Theological education, at its best, opens students to the reality of caring for people with, to use Catholic ethicist Margaret Farley's term, compassionate respect. In my view, this means fostering a way of paying attention to people that treats them as equal and different. That is, as equal without therefore being made over and assimilated into the image of what is taken by dominant visions as normal, which effectively erases difference, and as different without therefore being marginalized as deviant or abnormal, effectively denying equality. My basic axiom is that alterity in the shape of disability is a gift that teaches and empowers communities. As Carolyn Thompson writes, disability is about difference. It is one of the characteristics that contribute to the diversity, the plurality of life. This is important to stress, first of all, because such difference is often stigmatized and excluded by ableist ideologies. Second, it is important because disability itself is not singular, but diverse. The lives of people with disabilities are as varied and different as the lives of those without disabilities. Indeed, it is such difference that God creates as blessed and good, that through encountering it, we meet the divine. The roots of the injunction to hospitality lie here. The full participation of people with disabilities is not an option for the church, but rather a defining feature, opening up relationships of interdependence and respect and friendship far beyond what is often taken for inclusion. However, is it really inclusion when temporarily able-bodied people practice care as mainstreaming, normalizing, or rehabilitating? Disability scholar Patty Douglas notes in her work on autism and education that inclusion often amounts to a process by which people with disabilities, quote, are not only brought into view as a population subject to inclusion then, but also as a population potentially in need of improvement. Based upon what was just said about equality and difference, I'd like to propose an alternative to this. To be included entails one's difference being welcomed and made a part of a community, given access to intended participation in that community, treated as an equal belonging among others, like everyone else. To be inclusive, then, means intentionally making room for difference. The different treated as difference, not as pathology or as a deficit to be cured or fixed before being fully accepted. The link between these two, I believe, is access, in that disability is included through accommodation so that a person with disabilities can participate with others as a contributing part of a community's life. This means recognizing difference and diversity, bodily and neurologically, and welcoming it as part of us, not something other and abnormal, to be remade in the image of the same as normal. It is not so much a matter of accommodating so you can be a part of us on our terms, but rather so you can be with us, be with and augment us differently, accessing on your terms and being a formative part of who we are. Rather than communal conformity and homogeneity, a communal heterogeneity and diversity is introduced. Yet let us not move too quickly. Doesn't being intentional about accommodating persons with disabilities involve a kind of negative othering process, making different, by which people with disabilities reduce bodily and neurological diversity to disability as something gone wrong, a deficit needing accommodation? Doesn't recognizing disability, even to accept it as something other than pathology, require a negative expectation? These are serious problems of perception here, and they open up a host of thorny problems related to the ways communities and theological educators think about including and caring for people with disabilities. To help begin clarifying what is at stake here, I'd like to propose that we, those of us here today, both with and without disabilities, think of making 3 shifts, 3 changes in our thinking, changes that should be reflected in the theological education curriculum. 1. Disability is not simply a body gone wrong, a problem to be solved physically or remediated by curing. Nor, number 2, is disability a problem merely to be included, an anomaly that is somehow other and outside, which, according to the good graces of the community, needs to be brought inside and given access and power to be involved. For this often becomes a way temporarily non-disabled people claim nobly to give something to those others, the they, that they don't have, perpetuating an us, them, or inside-outside dualism that retains a paternalistic ethos of exclusion. It may be true that without accommodation, an impairment, physiological difference, bodily condition, becomes a disability, social and environmental experience of restriction that results from limited access, from being considered to have an impairment. However, number 3, outside preconceived programs and expectations fueled by dominant visions of what is normal, people with disabilities are persons equal with gifts, differences to offer. What does the gift of such alterity teach, and how is it theological? In my book, Vulnerable Communion, I try to show that rather than what counts for ability, for example, the capacity to think rationally, act autonomously, look healthy, or produce and purchase things as self-interested consumers, it is human vulnerability that is a starting point for discovering what we share equally in our differences, a source bearing the precious and fragile grace of solidarity with one another. Viewed through the lens of basic vulnerability, neediness or lack of ability as deemed by normalcy is not a flaw detracting from an otherwise pure and complete human nature. Rather, it is testimony to the fact that we receive our existence from each other, and recognizing this as a source of relational openness to others, who are in turn similarly constituted. Genuine wholeness is found not through ability, but through an acknowledgement of vulnerability that is made concrete in relations of mutual giving to and receiving from others. However, does this train of thinking not still subject certain kinds of people to inclusion and care as somehow special, precisely because of what I have just said is common to us all? And in us-them dualism implied despite my efforts to recognize disability as not simply about those others, but about vulnerability. As if there is a group of people more vulnerable and fragile, an exception to the norm, who need remunerative care and compassion. Here we must acknowledge the dangers of being inclusive, of opening up access through accommodation. In the last chapter of Changing the Subject, Women's Discourses and Feminist Theology, Mary McClintock Fulkerson notes the perils of progressive and liberal notions of inclusion. She appreciatively critiques feminist liberation theology for assuming that the feminist experience, this is a quote, that the feminist experience of certain texts and practices as oppressive is adequate to describe all forms of gendered subjectivities, close quote. Differences of location require taking seriously the fact that the empowerment of women may take on language not immediately compatible with that of liberationist approaches, such as those of Pentecostal women, which on the surface may appear misogynist, but at another level are liberative. McClintock Fulkerson notes that feminist discourse is often certified as a universalizing discourse from a position of privilege. Thus, In an effort to include and empower women's voices, many voices are actually excluded, the inside being lifted up and defined in a particular way that feigns universality and wide inclusion, an inclusion available to the outside only if they deny their differences. There is equality among women and men, but at the expense of differences among women. In her work at the vanguard of international feminist writing, Chandra Talpade Mohanty names such inclusionary practices colonizing and encourages caution when Western feminists speak of a common struggle among all women. She questions racialized and sexualized ideologies that mask privilege and challenges this by seeking to reorient feminist solidarity via a democratization of women's voices. Like McClintock Fulkerson, Mohanty advocates holding differences up as a kind of mirror to dominant feminist discourse, inviting self-critical questions about elements of its identity that its social location obscures. Here, the recognition of differences help destabilize normative assumptions about what constitutes an us. Differences become a teacher, opening up communities beyond inclusion toward acknowledging diversity as productive of life together, not a deficiency, differences being equal and not incorporated insofar as they might become the same. Inclusion, then, is potentially insidious in two ways. First, it trades upon misrecognizing difference as other, and in fact, names kinds of difference as outside, and thus anomalous, something to be brought to an inside that functions normatively as us, as an identity. As Miroslav Volf bluntly puts it, inclusion, quote, implicitly portrays them as a kind of people we are not. Inclusion functions by maintaining binary divisions that play out subtle mechanisms of exclusion. To be us, we need them to be different and not equal. And more, to be an inclusive us, we need to engage them insofar as they can become us, incorporated into the same. Second, because of this, inclusion can be uncritical and lack self-awareness, assuming the rightness of its own position as an outside, all the while masking the fact that the inside itself is a construction based upon othering an outside. For people with disabilities, then, inclusion is often experienced via logic that is exclusionary at first, based in a binary figuration, and subsequently assimilative, normalizing, all in the name of care and doing good. Let me give an example related to disability. Liberal or progressive theologies commonly tout inclusiveness, but in doing so, find themselves colluding with the cult of normalcy. They construe redemption as healing and rescue from social censure, while privileging the very discourses of power that project otherness upon those whose disability, and race, gender, etc., invalidates and sets them apart from the normal in society. Compassion, the drama of which convinces people that good is being done, quickly becomes, in the words of Sharon Betcher, the, quote, fantasy of noble graciousness, close quote. A condescending act of pity that invalidates the person in the name of an ideal that is elusive and faulted. Accordingly, Betcher is rightly critical of liberal authors like Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, who present a model of Jesus as healer and grassroots organizer, a Jesus that surveys his subjects as judge of health and inclusion, reaching out to society's defectives. We might ask, what's wrong with this? For Betcher, it too easily falls into the kinds of ethical hero Christology that does not disperse social dominance, but to the contrary, enacts it, by preserving the present-day dominant community's vision of normalcy, within which the different are paternally accommodated. Jesus performs with compassion, making place for society's invalids, actions that grant him special moral prestige and confirm his supreme, divine mastery, autonomy, and ability. But this only consents to contemporary notions of individualized health and wholeness. Consequently, such a portrayal is unhistorical by betraying distinctly modern ideologies. Betcher notes that while the portrait of Jesus as a gifted and charismatic leader played well in the earliest communities to advertise Christianity in Rome's competitive religious marketplace, it has expressed itself in modernity by appealing to the bourgeois ideal of individualism and self-sovereignty, creating the difference and neediness of disabled bodies. Thus, Borg and Crossan fail to address within what ideological theaters, what socioeconomic systems, illness and disability are defined in the earliest Christian communities. Modern attitudes of normalcy are imported in the re-descriptions of Jesus' life and ministry. This then glosses the more important problem. That is, how healing narratives can objectify deficiency and make it realistic, as if those with disabilities really are defective and in need of remediation in order to be saved. Redemption is too often seen in terms of miracle story, a remediation of defect, which restores an appropriate exercise of bodily autonomy. The effect does not ameliorate, but instead exacerbates social control in the form of a patronizing restoration to normalcy. What is needed, I believe, is a transformative sense of inclusion that connects members of the community, healing by empowering creative agency, not simply by including the helpless or by restoring bodily intactness, but by opening a physical, social space of non-domination and mutuality. However, often practiced are forms of inclusive accommodation tantamount to tolerance, normalizing assimilation, or restricted hospitality. First, with tolerance. Different bodies are given minimal access and put up with in ways that guarantee the safety of the status quo by keeping the dominant system intact. Tolerance allows deviation, but seeks to manage by distancing it as something that remains outside and unable to fully participate. That is, tolerating noises by disabled people in church, but considering them disruptive instead of communicative. Second, with normalizing or assimilative gestures of inclusion, different bodies are remade and fixed, cured to reflect the inside as they gain access to participation. That is, healing ceremonies. Here, romanticized notions of disability as special or gifted can become ways that people without disabilities project their own need to remake disability into a palatable and meaningful event, an ironic display of normalizing powers. Lastly, hospitality itself can be a false pretense. The host retaining mastery of the home and the guest rendered dependent by receiving gifts of welcome, the home remaining fully under control by the host. All three of these manifest what Iris Marion Young, following Theodore Adorno, calls the logic of identity, which, in an effort to provide unity and coherence, either reduces differences to the same via management and control, or rejects differences as utterly other. These dangers are especially real to me as a parent of a child with autism. How have I accommodated myself to neurodiversity in the shape of autism? Indeed, parenting has been a different life than I imagined, and it's been hard. No Hallmark card glossing is possible. The story I told at the start unsettles me personally because it challenges the assumptions by which I find order and meaning in the world as a parent of Chris, my son, who's 19, who is diagnosed with Asperger's, bipolar, OCD, ADHD, oppositional defiant, etc. In relation to Chris's predicament, I too often suppose that my identity and worth derives from the powers of ability as a good parent to love Chris by helping him get along in the world, coupled with a capacity to be independent and self-initiating, to achieve and be able to control my body in the face of others, and thus be recognized as contributing to others around me, children, work, church, etc., in some way. The irony that Chris raises for me, however, is that this whole setup is bogus. Being in relationship with Chris has taught me that caring for others is not a matter of helping, of giving from a position of strength, but of recognizing my vulnerability and becoming open to the ways I receive from others. Others, in ways that include their disabilities, become essential not only to my own flourishing, but also to the common good of the communities in which I flourish together with Chris. This opens up the power of giving through first receiving from Chris. There is more at stake, then, in the matter of disability than an impairment that someone happens to have. For disability is not a flaw, something to be remedied or helped. And frequently, inclusive care is offered in kindness, but in ways that don't really encounter persons with disabilities. For example, there is often real tension between the love we seek to embody, which seeks goodness and acts in solidarity with others, and the extent to which such love can be built upon projections and misunderstanding when confronting another's vulnerability and or suffering alleged to have happened. This tension is real for me as a parent. I love my son and sometimes feel a painful distance from the way he experiences his life, and the pain it sometimes involves. I seek solidarity, to be there with and for him. I experience the anguish of trying to do right by him, seeking to help him feel good about being in his own skin, but coming up short. And so relentlessly I seek solidarity, to understand him and to be an advocate. However, often the solidarity that actually emerges is based more upon my assumptions and expectations than his unique way of being. I project what I would feel onto his experiences as a way of connecting and including. My experience as a non-autistic person is projected onto his world and way of being. And my expectation of what a parent should do is involved too. So in fear of failing as a parent, I seek to see my success reflected by his conformity to certain norms. Thus, as a caregiver, I miss attending to him, and instead ending up attending to my own needs and assumptions about human life. An example of this occurred the other night. Chris was asked to finish his video gaming and became agitated, immediately shutting down and going to sleep. I assumed he was upset because of being told to get off his game, and initially stood back and waited to attend to him until he calmed down. After a few minutes passed, I went to check on him and found him teary. I quickly realized more was going on than a tantrum because he had to get off his game. He was feeling overwhelmed and misunderstood related to an entirely different matter, but didn't know how to express it. This is a small example of how I interpreted his reaction in ways that missed what he was actually feeling. I was glad I didn't jump in right away to scold him for having a tantrum. Waiting paid off. The peril here is that I am often too large with my own agenda for helping Chris, which keeps me from paying attention to him and his own way, to him as different. I seek to make him the same, but at the price of denying the uniqueness and preciousness of his neurodiversity. One of the most difficult things for me is to let go and listen, to cover my mouth and stop speaking and directing, and instead to attend to Chris's voice. What is he saying to me? Where is his voice? The point I am trying to make is that a caregiver's desire for connection with the one cared for, rightly concerned with his or her well-being, can become perilously desperate and assume its own rightness. Not that it is therefore selfish or unloving, rather that it is mistaken and misdirected. Caring inclusion can, in this way, wrongly assume another's condition is less than healthy or normal and seek to relieve or remedy the condition by taking in and caring for. It pretends to know what it would be like in the condition. Disability is often perceived falsely as warranting such inclusive care. This is false in three ways. First, it is false because non-disabled people project normalizing assumptions about what it means to be human onto different bodies. Second, it is false because people with disabilities are silenced and excluded, not granted the space to speak and or live from their own experiences. And third, it is false because it lacks moral openness to others' ways of being. I presume someone is equal only insofar as they can be like me. So I open access by accommodating in a way that denies their real difference. Hence, suffering is often attributed to disability in a way that assimilates persons with disabilities into experiences that violate the integrity and dignity of life in the way that it is lived differently. The tyranny of the normal remains intact, but disability is neither a tragedy needing inclusive care nor a deprivation requiring healing cure. By way of concluding, I want to consider the implications of this for theological education. I suggest that theological education should do more than simply critique normalizing inclusiveness. It should also promote an alternative. In my book, I advocate hospitality. But I am convinced now that such hospitality does not survive without a transformative spirituality of attentiveness. It is through attentiveness to difference, rooted in God's incarnate attentiveness to humanity in Christ, that communities become transformed into forms of inclusion that receive people with disabilities with respect, opened to unanticipated gifts. I have learned this from my life with Chris. My son's life calls out to me, pay attention, not to your way, but to mine, and be with me. The life in him confronts me outside the boundaries of my expectations and ushers me into a relationship that I can't control on my own terms, but which has transformed me. First, it is life and human dignity that takes priority. Life seeks life, and in different ways. The preciousness of another's humanity is not limited to abilities or disabilities. It radiates its own beauty in smiles, laughter, gestures, and even words sometimes, as loved by God. Dignity is a reservoir of abundance, exceeding ways we might attribute suffering, inability, or abnormality to a person. So, second, and my responsibility to this preciousness is to honor and respect, creating space for its own ways of flourishing, not based on my ways, and giving, not based on what I calculate as worthy of value. This means risk, being vulnerable to another's vulnerable dignity. Risking relationship to another requires opening to another's way of being that challenges and changes me, that confronts me with my own inadequacy, and that even causes anguish. But it also allows me to receive the gift of another person. Genuine care, at least as I experience it, comes from attuning myself to another's rhythm and cadences. That is to say, inclusive caring is not about my way, but yours. This entails a hermeneutic readjustment, an attentiveness that bears witness to another in the shape of a vulnerable responsiveness. It is from such responsiveness that accommodation to difference moves beyond assimilation and becomes expansive and transformative. I am changed, the community is changed, by adjusting to its way of being to another's way of being. The story of a we shifts by attending to and entering the stories of persons with disabilities. Certainly the process involves patience and humility. Sometimes it involves deep disorientation and struggle, even anguish, as my own life as a parent testifies to. But it also cultivates, perhaps because of these, relationships of friendship and mutuality and care that are transformative and grace-filled. Receiving others via such attentiveness is, as Letty Russell would say, the practice of hospitality at its best. There is no inside-outside binary, but rather a round-table gathering into which each guest is invited as host to one another, joined in relationships of mutual partnership and giving and receiving, rather than dependency relationships of unilateral caring and giving. An attentive practice listens and receives, letting be the speaking voice of another and hearing how she or he perceives. In this way, the margins and the center, the guest and the host, each circulates and shifts among the other, distinctions blurred. The listener comes to confront the biases, false assumptions, and unequal power quotients that obscure encountering the difference of another. Furthermore, the listener responds, adjusting to the way of another by entering into their story. And the speaking voice grows itself and gains dignity by being heard and accommodated. The dynamic shifts then as each trades roles and becomes an other for and with the other in an ongoing exchange of mutual welcome. Communities of genuine partnership are built upon this transformational process. And these partnerships also entail a commitment to justice work, confronting enduring systems of power on micro and communal levels, because vulnerability is often not parceled out equally within such ongoing exchanges of mutual welcome. Theological education can be transformed and transformative if, in the end, we all understand there is no hard and fast line between ability and disability, but rather a nexus of reciprocity that is based on our vulnerable condition as human beings. All of life comes to us as a gift, an endowment that is received in countless ways from others throughout our lifetime. To exist as a finite creature is to be vulnerable. Acknowledging this begins to blur the line between giving and receiving, ability and disability. Thus, having a disability is not equivalent to being ill or sick, needing a cure, or needing special help, or even being weak. Full personhood is neither diminished by disability nor confirmed by ability. Instead, it is a factor of the interdependent relationships we share with one another as creatures loved into being by God. There is a wider horizon of inclusiveness in which all persons in their uniqueness and vulnerability coexist within the enfolding presence of a gracious God. And it is precisely such vulnerability that God creates as good and embraces in Christ, attentive to the frailty of the human condition. If theological education is about forming Christian caregivers, receivers who reflect God's compassionate and inclusive attentiveness, we need a radically different set of criteria to think about care than presently exists. We need learning communities cultivated by more than generous attitudes and specific knowledge content. Students need apprenticeship into habits of care formed by a transformative spirituality of attentiveness with people with disabilities. Habits that cultivate mutual partnerships of vulnerability, open to the transformative power of God's grace. And such grace often surprises and disrupts on the way towards transformation, coming unexpected and in ways that are uncomfortable, dislodging the sway of normalcy. Attentiveness risks exposure to something that calls us into question, undoing what has been taken for granted about us in opening up something more than we were before. What would happen to our opening story if this kind of attentiveness were in play? What would our educational institutions, let alone our churches, look like within the arc of such attentiveness? Thank you.